Watching houses just crash and crumble right into sinkhole. That was actually a year or two ago, summer of 2017. But just watching these homes, it's like you think your house is fine. You've been living in it, it's working for you, and then one day it just sort of collapses because it turns out the foundation isn't what you thought it was. And so I thought that's crazy, and I was thinking about kind of what we choose to build our homes on, right? I mean, it's like sort of the ground out here is different than in other parts of the country. Sometimes people build it on concrete slab and all sorts of different things. One of the places that you can build your house, and there's actually a famous house for it out in Wisconsin. And now listen, there's not a lot to go see in Wisconsin. I'm from the Midwest. So you can go see a lot of dairy farms, a lot of cheese heads as well out there. But so what might seem boring to you is actually a great tourist attraction out there. Melinda, my back screen isn't working. If you can find Ryan, thank you. And but I wanted to show you this, and it's called the House on the Rock, and it's in Wisconsin. People actually pay to go view the House on the Rock, and you can tour it and walk all inside. And the architecture is all unique and interesting. But just built on this huge, thick, like solid rock, and it reminds me. Actually, Jesus talks some about homes and kind of architecture and kind of what you build them on. And he was given a talk one day. Well, less so like a sermon. I think he was more kind of walking around with people. And so picture this: you're sort of like sitting on a hillside, and Jesus walking around and just dropping this like radical wisdom, like stuff that people have just never heard. They would just blow their minds. He would say stuff like, you were raised to think that, when your enemies hurt you, you hurt them back. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, that's not God's way to live. God's wisdom is way better than revenge. God says when you have enemies that hurt you, you know what you do? You pray for them. You love on them. You actually walk an extra mile with them. You bless them. Maybe they won't remain your enemies for very long. He says, you've heard what's said, you kind of grew up with kind of this idea of really kind of pointing out people's faults. So yes, even back then, before they had social media, they were really good at criticizing each other and pointing out people's faults. They knew how to do it. And he said, that's not God's way to live. God's wisdom says, you know what, I'm so busy working on myself. I got this big old log sticking out of my own eye. I can't even see everybody else's faults because I'm working on the stuff in me. He says, that's the godly way to live. He's just blowing their mind. He says, you're raised kind of with the thought that, I just always have to worry, just so much worry and anxiety. Believe it or not, back then, just as much worry and anxiety as we deal with here in 2019. And Jesus says, you know what, that's not the godly way to live. Walking around just having to be worried all the time. Am I going to have enough? Am I going to figure it out? He says, God's wisdom helps you look around. And you notice birds that are flying around. You say, look at these birds. They're not starving to death. They always seem to have enough. If God can take care of them, how much more would he take care of the people he actually created in his image? And so he's just kind of dropping all this wisdom, and their minds has to be blown. Just such different ways of thinking. It's hard. We talked about last week to unlearn things, and to think so differently than our usual paradigm, so different than our culture. But Jesus tells them all this stuff, and then he closes. It's actually kind of a famous talk that he gives. Some people call it the Sermon on the Mount. But he ends up closing this talk with like a warning. So it's all these inspiring words, but he ends the talk with a warning, and his very last word, actually the whole talk, is the word crash. And he gives this whole warning. He says, listen, of all the stuff I've said today, it's going to do you no good unless you listen to it and you follow it. That's real wisdom. Not just listening, not just knowing it. It says listen and follow. That's wisdom. That's the kind of wisdom that builds a house on the rock. Like people in Wisconsin. That's the kind of wisdom that knows how to build a house on a solid foundation. Because then he goes on and says, very interesting truth, one that you already know. He says, you know what life's going to be full of? Full of storms, Jesus says. Storms are coming. You already know that. You most likely either just got out of a storm in your life, or some of you are in the midst of one, and we'd love to pray for you afterwards and walk with you through it. And others, well, our next storm is coming. I didn't want to remind you of that, but there's probably other storms on the way, right? So we just know storms of life are coming. They come everywhere. You can be an atheist, Christian, Jew, Muslim, doesn't matter. Storms of life come all the time. Jesus said, but here's the difference. When your life's built on the wisdom of God, the storms don't have to crash your life. But then he says, but you can also choose to build it the unwise way. He calls it the foolish way. Build it on sand. It lasts for a little while, but eventually it crashes, like in the video that we saw. And so he's trying to help us understand that God's wisdom for our life, it means everything. That's why it matters so much, because storms are coming. But when our life is built on God, the storms don't have to have the last word in our life. Our life can withstand that. And maybe you felt a little bit like you'd say, yeah, that's the exact picture of my life right now. That it is slowly kind of sinking. Maybe you feel like sinking kind of further into debt, further into loneliness, maybe further into kind of feeling lost in your life. Or maybe you just feel like life's kind of crashing. But I got a lot of good friends, even some of my own siblings and family members. Career and job stuff's just crashing right now. They're trying to figure out what's next, and I'm praying for them, trying to walk with them through it. I know a lot of people kind of financially feels like they're crashing, and a few close friends whose marriage is doing the same. And so, maybe you feel like, that's it, just kind of sinking, crumbling, crashing down. And God said, Jesus already said, I know the storms are coming, but God doesn't want your life to have to crash. He says, I'll give you something that can withstand any storm, the hardest storms, when you build your life on my wisdom. So that's what we've been talking about in this series, is the wisdom of God. And we're going to actually spend all of October on it as well, because there's just so much of God's wisdom. And if we could really get it in us, how to build our lives on that foundation can make all the difference in the world. So we've been studying a guy that many people call the wisest person who ever lived. He really was the original wise guy, because he was like a wise guy. And Solomon, his dad was King David. We talk about David a lot this summer. Great man, person after God's own heart. But as David passed away, he passed on his throne to be the king of Israel, passed it on to his son Solomon. And as Solomon is first starting his new career as king, the very first thing he says is, God, if I could have anything in the world, I just want your wisdom. I need your wisdom. So I can do my job well. I need your wisdom in my personal life, my whole life. And God says, I love it when people ask for wisdom. I love to bless my people with wisdom. That's still true, by the way. These Bible stories didn't just happen. They still happen. And so when we seek God's wisdom, he said, I love to bless you with wisdom. He says, Solomon, I'm going to give you so much wisdom, you'll be the wisest person who ever lived, actually. And Solomon goes on, as we've said, ends up writing even 3 books that make it into the Old Testament, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, and Proverbs. And we've been studying the life of Solomon and some of what he wrote down in Proverbs, and kind of going back and forth through from Proverbs to his life stories. Here's what's powerful about Solomon's wisdom. It didn't just like build a nice little life for him. It actually impacted people all around him. And not even just his family and friends, even people from far away. And that's today's story. It's in 1 Kings 10. I don't know if you've ever heard Queen of Sheba. Sometimes her name gets thrown around. But this is a little story about, about the Queen of Sheba. So she's from Sheba, which means she's not from Israel. So she doesn't know Solomon's God, but she's heard about him. She's heard about Solomon. Word has spread. I don't know how word spread back then, because they didn't have social media or any media. So if things went viral, it just meant a lot of people were talking about it. A lot of word of mouth. So she heard about Solomon. And here's what happens. The Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon, heard about the relation and the name of his Lord. So she came to test him with hard questions. Isn't that what people do sometimes? You know who you are. Kind of the skeptic. Somebody tells you, I know somebody who's really smart, and they know everything about this. And then you think, yeah, we'll see. And you just want to go test them. It's like that competitive side of us. I just want to see if they really know everything, see if you can trip them up. So that's what she's doing. She came to test him with hard questions. Arriving at Jerusalem, she came with a very great caravan. This lady travels in style. She brings tons of camels and they're carrying all these spices, which were super valuable back then. She's bringing large quantities of gold, precious stones. She's traveling with all this stuff. I guess I shouldn't complain when my wife has to bring her big purse everywhere we go, because, Queen of Sheba, I mean, she's like, be like, oh, wait, honey, before we leave, can you go get the other camels, because I need some more of them, and then, oh, can you go get all the boxes that have all my precious stones, right? I mean, it's just like, come on, lady, we're just trying to get out of the house. So anyway, so she's traveling with a lot of stuff. And she comes to Solomon, and she talks with him about all that she had on her mind. And Solomon answered all of her questions. Nothing was too hard for the king to explain to her. And when the Queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon, saw the palace he had built, saw all the food on his table, all the seating of his officials, all his attending servants in their robes, all his cupbearers, all the burnt offerings he'd given to the Lord, she was overwhelmed, the Bible says. She was just blown away. Like, I've just never met anybody like this. I've never seen this level of just, like achievement in life. She says to the king, the report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom, it's all true. I didn't believe these things until I came to see them with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half of it was told me. In wisdom and in wealth, you have far exceeded all the reports that I've heard. How happy your men must be. How happy your officials who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. I think she's jealous and wishes she could work for him. Like, how happy all people that work for you. They just get to listen to your wisdom all the time. Then she says something really cool. She goes, praise be to the Lord your God. It's not her God. Praise be to the Lord your God. She says, for he has delighted in you and placed you on the throne of Israel. And because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, he has made you king to maintain justice and righteousness. She says, I've never seen anything like this. And I love that even though she doesn't know his God, she's still just so blown away by seeing that. And here's why. Here's why. It's not just because Solomon was the smartest person who ever lived. It's because he had God's wisdom and he actually built his life on it. Because remember, life is hard. Storms are coming. Well, John Wayne, legendary actor, he said it like this. He said, life is hard. And it's even harder when you're stupid. And so, hey, I didn't say it. I'm just saying. John Wayne said that. He's just trying to call it like it is. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I'll say the opposite. I'll say, but life can actually be a little easier when you actually have the wisdom of God. Because here's the deal about the wisdom of God. Some of you already know this. Some of us, it's just very different than how we grew up thinking. Part of why we've never gotten into the Bible, why it always feels like a chore, a discipline to get in the Bible or come to church. Because we just don't believe God's wisdom is all that practical for our real life. We say, his wisdom is great for Sundays and all, good for church, good for the religious part of my life, but I need help with my Monday mornings. I need help with the real life junk that I'm going through in relationships and in money and at work and at school, and I'm just trying to figure out even my whole direction in life, navigate all these relational conflicts. And I want to help convince you that God's wisdom is meant for that. It's not just theological and theoretical, it's practical. It's not just philosophical, it's practical. And God's wisdom also, by the way, isn't just for our afterlife. He wants to speak into this present life as well. Some people really want to get into studying the afterlife and kind of revelation. I want to understand all the levels of heaven and the jewels and the crowns and the beasts and all these things. And listen, it's pretty fascinating stuff to understand, and sometimes it can kind of help enrich your relationship with God. But don't get lost just looking at afterlife. God speaks a little bit about afterlife, but he speaks a lot about this life, though. All right? Your present life. He wants to give us wisdom and direction. The theological word that Bible scholars like to use is the word orthodoxy. People talk about an orthodox Christian, people who stick to this right set of beliefs. That's what orthodoxy means, is having a right set of beliefs. But there's another word that's just as important, is we have our orthodoxy, but we can't forget our orthopraxy. And orthopraxy is about practicing the right things. And so you can believe the right things and not practice them, and then you got all this orthodoxy and no orthopraxy. So, next time you're at a party, just be like, hey, how's your orthopraxy going? Just kind of like that, and people think you're super smart, or they'll just think you're weird. I don't know. Maybe don't try that. But we got to have both line it up, right? Because part of what impressed the Queen of Sheba wasn't just, wow, you know so many facts. You can quote so many statistics. She says, I can see what wisdom has done for you. I see all your achievements, all it's accomplished for you. Remember, she was listed off people, all the places, the palace you have, even the food. You could just see how wisdom played out in his life. That's why wisdom is different than knowledge, as we've been talking about in this series. Right? Knowledge is knowing things, information, and wisdom is applying it. Now listen, we're not putting down knowledge. Knowledge is incredibly important. And the more we grow in knowledge, the more we can even grow in how much we know about who God is. So knowledge is incredibly important. The pursuit of knowledge. I'm a huge learner and love just always reading, learning, growing in knowledge. Problem is we stop at knowledge. We can't just have knowledge. Wisdom is applied knowledge. Wisdom is living it out. Some people would call it, kind of difference between like intelligence and wisdom. Some would say it's like book smarts and street smarts. That's sometimes how we talk about, like all these book smarts, but no street smarts. In other words, yeah, but they don't know how to apply it in their regular life. The psychology way of putting it, they talk about your IQ and your EQ. Your IQ, of course, our intelligence quotient. You can take IQ tests. I've never done that. I think I don't want to know the result. No, but you can take IQ tests, find out, kind of like where your intelligence is. But there's a huge emphasis lately, by the way, especially on companies who are hiring and looking for people, is they're more looking harder at people's EQ, their emotional intelligence quotient, kind of their relational quotient. Because and maybe you've worked with people like this, you can have smartest person ever in their field, but if they can't actually work with people, if they can't actually apply their knowledge to solve problems, it just doesn't get them that far. So it's really about this idea of having, IQ plus EQ, having wisdom, applying that knowledge. If you have all IQ and no EQ, then you end up, kind of like this guy. If you ever watch Big Bang Theory, and if not, don't worry about it. Just went off the air, so series is done. But it was a classic comedy around for at least 11 seasons. And Sheldon Cooper, maybe the TV character in all of history with the highest IQ of anybody, his character, but he had really low EQ. He didn't know how to relate to people. And thus, the comedy ensues, right? Because it's like super smart, but always so awkward with people, doesn't understand relational cues or sarcasm. And so then that's where all the comedy comes from. But so that's what happens when you're kind of IQ, no EQ. You can go the other way and be really good. It's kind of like good with people and fun to be around, but just not all that smart. And I don't know. I can only think of Kung Fu Panda. I'm sure there's other better examples, maybe just because he's like Jack Black, right? But it'd be he's likable, and everyone in the movies loves to hang out with him. Although if they keep making more of them, they're probably going to run out of ideas, and he won't be as likable anymore. But anyway, in the first 3 movies, he was right. So he's all like fun to be around, but he has kind of low IQ. Now, if you're low at both, by the way, if you don't really have IQ or EQ, then you're basically just Michael Scott. Which, while funny, and I would enjoy watching your life, it probably doesn't get you very far because you got to be good with people and know how to apply it, right? So it's the idea of having knowledge and wisdom together, as the great theologian Jimi Hendrix likes to remind us. I don't know if you want to live your life by the wisdom of Jimi Hendrix either. That'll get you somewhere, but probably not where you want to go in life. And right, but I love his point that knowledge can be about accumulating facts and just wanting to kind of speak them, but wisdom's always seeking and listening. And wisdom's always living it out. And the wisdom of God can do so much in our lives. So we looked at last week, we read Proverbs 3. If you've never read Proverbs 3, definitely want to read it. It says, when we trust in God and His wisdom with all our heart, lean not on our own wisdom. Here's all these benefits it has in our life. And one of those we looked at was is joy. It says it'll bring us joy. And you look at that here, that's part of what the Queen of Sheba noticed. She said, look how much the people around you even are happy. Wisdom has brought joy into your life, into their life. Maybe you read that and go, yeah, it makes sense. But does it? Isn't usually our experience, if super, super smart people, are they people that are really full of joy? Are people around them? Or do people never feel good enough when they're around them? I was thinking how, actually, in our culture, we kind of have the opposite saying. Here's a cliche that maybe everybody in here has heard at least once in your life. You know what really brings joy or bliss? Ignorance is bliss. That's what we say, right? Ignorance is bliss. Kind of like the less you know, the happier you can be, right? But is that true? I think about, just kind of wrestling with this idea of, wisdom and joy. Is it really wisdom that brings bliss and joy, or is it ignorance? I read one quote where somebody said, well, ignorance is bliss only for the ignorant. For everybody else, it's just a big pain. And I was like, yeah, that's pretty accurate, right? And so God says wisdom is what will lead you to joy. Think about some of the wisest people you know in your life, and you can answer for you, and you may know exceptions. But as I think about the wise people I know, I feel like, yeah, there are people that are living a lot of joy in their life. We just honored a staff member this week. We have a lead pastor over all the New Break locations, Pastor Mike, and he actually started New Break a few decades ago. He lives a couple blocks from here in OB, actually, so you'll see him around OB. And he's going to be retiring in the next year or two, but his wife, Teresa, has also been on our staff, and she's incredibly wise. She's the one people would always go to for coaching, help me figure out relationship stuff. Staff would go to her and attenders. She's awesome. So she's retiring before Mike, so she can be full-time grandma and all of that now. And so we were just honoring her this week, kind of like a farewell dinner. We'll get to see her because she'll be around OB. But if you ever run into Teresa, I promise one of the first things you'll kind of be like, "You're right, Carter. She's just super happy. She's just so positive. Just has such a joy, just this joyful spirit." And here's why: her life isn't any easier than yours. She's had all sorts of junk in her life. She would tell you her testimony growing up in the 60s. Her parents were not only hippies who did drugs, they invited the kids to the table to do drugs together. I guess the family that does drugs together stays together. I don't know, but that was their philosophy. So she grew up lot of kind of messed up stuff with family, a lot of kind of broken relationships, and end up with different kind of stepkids and things along the way. She's had many storms in her life. Of course, ministry brings with it a whole bunch of storms, hard life, and she's full of joy. And I believe it's because she's built her life on the wisdom of God. And I was thinking about that. How does wisdom lead to joy? And I don't know the full answer yet because I'm still learning. But at least one of the ways I believe it does is you think about the things that rob us of joy the most often. Let's think about your kind of Monday through Friday life, things that are robbing you from joy. Maybe it's just annoying things, like irritating things people do, or our kids losing their mind, people in traffic cutting us off, coworkers being like this, social media, stuff going on in the country, right? And all this just feels like just robs our joy. But wisdom, godly wisdom, helps us have a bigger perspective. We have a bigger focus. We know that while these things can be minor annoyances and irritations, that's not the big picture. That's not really where God's going. That's not where my life is going. I might hit speed bumps of stuff, and it can be annoying, but it doesn't crash my whole life. People with wisdom have this bigger perspective. And they're able to see what God is up to. That leads to a whole lot more joy than just kind of living the roller coaster of just kind of going with what everybody around me is doing and how circumstances are going. So God's wisdom leads us to joy. The other thing it does, which we haven't talked about yet, and not only accomplishes so much in your life, it can literally point other people to who God is. I'm telling you, we've been talking in this series. People in our lives, in your world, they are starving for wisdom. Everybody's looking for answers. Parents are. People want answers to all the problems in Ocean Beach and all the problems in America. And everybody just wants answers and figure stuff out and financial stuff and all these things. If you and I learn to live out the wisdom of Jesus as we go to work, as we go to school, as we figure out how to serve and bless our town, and as we figure out how to navigate relationships, when backstabbing happens and gossip and all these things, if we're learning how to live with the wisdom of God, I'm telling you, it'll speak loud. It'll point people to who God is, just like with Queen of Sheba. And they'll be like, wow, the Lord, you're God. There's something different about you and the way you live. I've seen it. God really kind of blew me away with it, something I never thought would happen with this guy. We became friends in high school, and then we ended up going to the same college together. And I mentioned before I went to a huge public university, but it's actually where I really kind of got on fire for my faith. I found a great Christian group and started hanging out with them. So I'm really like throughout college, end up following Jesus even harder and kind of getting into it. And my buddy went the opposite way. he actually, we were both raised kind of going to Catholic church, but as soon as we hit college, same place, he went the other way, and he actually became really staunch atheist. And he's a real intellectual guy, high IQ, and loves to read, debate, and all this stuff. And so he's becoming a stronger atheist. I'm becoming a stronger Jesus follower. But we keep our friendship going all through college. We were going really long bike rides together, get to have all these conversations. He would tease me a lot and make fun of me about kind of God and faith. But I could take it because I kind of knew him. Then, I could tease him back and some of this. So, but honestly, one of those guys, I'm like, man, I'm never going to be able to argue him to Jesus. I mean, I won't even get him to concede one point. He's just too well read, too intellectual with this. But the wisdom of God can do something that me and my knowledge couldn't. One day he came to me. I mean, he'd been doing, I'll say, normal for guys that age, at least back people I was around. He's kind of into porn and hooking up with different, a few different girls and stuff. So he comes to me after one of the girls that he ended up kind of spending the night with, but then they kind of break up right away. And he came and he goes, "You know what, Carter? I don't believe in your Bible and your God and all that stuff, but I'll tell you this, one of your values," he didn't say wisdom, but it's what he meant. "One of your values that you live your life by, this whole idea of purity until marriage," he said, "I get it now. I get it. Because this is a tough way to live." And he saw it. He felt the effects of his human wisdom and how far it got him. And when you live God's wisdom, even when it's really countercultural, it can point people to the source of wisdom. And that's what it did for Solomon. That's what it did for my buddy. Because wisdom helps us to do the right thing, even in the face of kind of the rest of culture, in the face of all the storms that we face. The Queen of Sheba saying, "Solomon, I mean, God's equipped you with the wisdom to accomplish righteousness, to live justly." And I'm guessing you've already discovered this in your life, but unfortunately, it seems like most of the time in our life, the right thing to do and the hard thing to do are usually the same thing to do, right? Would it be nice if just once the right thing to do just came really easy and you're just like, "Hey, that's it. It didn't stretch me at all. It just comes totally natural." Once in a while we get that, but so often doing the right thing be really hard because it's countercultural, or it's lonely, or it just stretches us. You think about even, I have the choice of, why don't I just fire back at somebody, all the stuff that's going on in my head anyway, or why don't I be humble and forgive them and try to reconcile and bless them? I mean, which way is the easier way? Right? But wisdom helps us to do the right thing, even when it's the hard thing. And that's what God wants for his people. He knows that for your life to be built on this foundation, then it just won't have to crash when the storms come. And so that's why he's always wanting to speak this wisdom into us. And one thing I want to help us do in the series, keep growing in how we hear God's wisdom, how we pursue it. We looked at a few ways in last week's message, but I wanted to add a few more this time. How do we keep seeking and kind of gaining God's wisdom? One of the ways we do that, we just got to make it a priority. And I know we would all agree that it should be a priority, but the challenge comes in, will I actually make it a priority? Am I just kind of floating through life? Am I just racing through life? Just kind of always so busy, kind of get to the next, I just got to make it to the next weekend, the next vacation, wait till things calm down, which they never do. And, I really want wisdom of God. I'm just too busy right now. And then that's how we end up having, midlife, late life, Christ going, how come I never accomplished the things I thought God wanted me to? How come I never connected with him the ways that I meant to? I've got to prioritize it. It was cool seeing a group of people this week. I got to speak to one of the Point Loma NAS classes, and we have a lot of their students that come here, and we love that. But it was a class full of freshmen, and professor had me, a couple other people come in and speak to them, and I love their questions. These freshmen in college, and they're pursuing wisdom. Huge priority for them. Before they get anywhere else in their educational career, they're asking, how do I discern God's will? How do I know His calling on my life? How do I know the things I'm meant to do, not meant to do? How do I know if He's calling me into this kind of ministry or into marketplace? I'm like, man, they're seeking wisdom so much earlier, than a lot of the rest of us ended up doing it. And you can just see that they're making it a priority. Because part of what making wisdom a priority does for us is it helps us understand the urgency in life. I'm trying to give you kind of a glimpse of wisdom kind of all through the Old and New Testament. So we're jumping into a few different books here. But Apostle Paul, never forget the first time I read these words. Again, I was in college, growing with my faith, plugged into this Christian group. And one of the things this Christian group did was they said, we like to go over spring break. We do a mission trip to Daytona Beach. And this was Daytona Beach. If you went there in spring break now, I think it's kind of lame. But if you went there in the 90s, that's when MTV was set up right on Daytona Beach. And that's when it's like the central party in the country going on. Craziest place to go. And they said, we go there on mission trip spring break. And we talk to people about Jesus. I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. I've never really talked to other people about my faith. Definitely not to drunk frat guys about it either. So that sounds pretty intimidating. I'm just saying. And they said, oh yeah, well not only that, you also are going to have to raise money to be able to go. It's pretty expensive to go. And I'm just like, yeah, I don't think that's me. I don't know if I can do that. But no joke, I was brand new to reading the Bible, and I'm reading one of Paul's letters, and I come across this verse that if you want to live wise, you learn how to make the most of every opportunity. Man, God, is this one of those, like, opportunities? It's one of the things that called me to do. It really stretched me. So I prayed to God about it, try to listen, and felt like God was saying, yeah, this opportunity I want you to do. I thought, all right. And, it scared me a lot. I went ahead and started asking some of my relatives kind of if they would, give me money to support me on this trip. And ended up, getting just barely enough and went and did it. It was scary, totally stretched me out of my comfort zone. And super cool. Just saw God do stories and just kind of, really, really cool things. Saw about just really trying to be light and hope in like a really challenging place. And so just learned a ton. I actually ended up doing it the next 3 years of college as well. Down there every time. And God just really spoke to me that idea. Wise people know that we don't just squander opportunities, don't just procrastinate. All right, we make the most. Now listen, this doesn't mean that you just have to, just do everything all the time, right? We got to have some wisdom in our boundaries. But when opportunities come your way, part of making the most is, do I at least bring them prayerfully before God? Or do we have opportunities, I just write them off? No, I couldn't afford that. Nope, I'll never have time for that. Nope, that's not me. It's not my personality. That would scare me out of my comfort zone. I don't do that. You can talk to Jenny, by the way, who was up here speaking. Her least favorite thing to do is actually speaking on stage in front of people. And so she could have easily said, nope, I don't do that. That's not how I'm wired at all. And I think she's gotten really, really good at it. Right? But she knows she has to make the most of opportunities. So what opportunity is God bringing to you? By the way, sometimes people ask, I got to speak at a church in San Diego a couple weeks ago on just the middle of the week to some of their leaders. They said, hey, we just want to learn how to serve our community. Like the way you guys have an OB. How do you serve your community? I said, well, I didn't have a brilliant strategy, but I'll tell you what I started with is we did this. Make the most of every opportunity. I like to call it lead with a yes. Lead with a yes. At least at the beginning anyway. And so when we first started here and just said, anytime somebody needs help, yes, we're going to go figure out how to do it. And all the different meetings happening in the community, yep, we're going to go to that. Lead with a yes. Make the most of all the opportunities. You can ask my staff team. They're like, man, you were dragging us to a lot of stuff. I'm like, I know. That's just because I'm like every opportunity. We just got to see which ones God's going to work in. And so by leading with a yes, then God, worked through those. And he taught us things. Some of them didn't turn into anything, but we learned something valuable or met people that we would meet later. So where are opportunities in your life? Because godly wisdom says I take those seriously. I at least bring them to God at the very least. Godly wisdom says I know to make the most of every opportunity because, as Solomon's dad, King David, wrote in Psalms, real godly wisdom understands the brevity of life. That there's an urgency to life. That I don't just procrastinate or go float along with the flow of culture, never stopping long enough. Say, is this where God's leading? Is this where I want to be in my job or in my relationships or in my spiritual life? Or am I going to do something about it? Because life is short. That's why older people that you know that get wiser are always telling you life is short, because they understand it, right? Because that's part of what comes with wisdom. So that's part of how we get the wisdom of God, is we learn to find it in all of these kinds of opportunities. We also find it, of course, in the Bible. We've already hit really hard on that, but I'm going to say it again because I mean, that is the place to find the wisdom of God written down. And if you haven't gotten into the Bible yet, man, I mean, I'll just say it, you're missing out. I mean, you will absolutely find wisdom of God in there. It's awesome. One of my friends here is in one of my life groups and kind of newer to the Bible. In fact, his mom just sent him, how cool is this? Mom sent an awesome study Bible, full of study notes and maps. He said, now I read this Bible. He said, I actually can't go to bed now without reading the Bible. I miss it. I'm getting so much out of it. And if you're someone who's never read the Bible, you can totally relate. That's where he was not too long ago, and now just can't get enough of it. Getting into the Word of God. God will speak wisdom into you. If you don't know where to start, we've been encouraging you. You can start in the book of Proverbs. There's 31 Proverbs. You could read one a day. October 1st is this week, so if you started there, then by Halloween, you will have the whole book of Proverbs in you. Actually, you'll probably only pick up a little bit out of it because there's so much wisdom in there. But you'll have more wisdom in you than you did at the start, and then you could try it again the next month. The other great place to start, I talked to somebody this morning, first time here, grew up in the Mormon church. So he's been afraid to walk into a Christian one for 15 years. But he finally came in. And he said, I need to start reading the Bible. And I started in the Gospel of Mark. And I said, awesome, because I always tell people you should start in the stories of Jesus. And he's like, it's really good. It's really good. I'm seeing a lot of stuff about Jesus that I didn't know. Getting in the Word of God. You will find so much of God's wisdom in there. And then as we find that, we have to challenge it against our wisdom. And again, that's a hard thing to do. The reason I live by my own wisdom is because it's my wisdom, and we like our own stuff, and it's hard to let go of our own stuff. No matter where we got it from, we think it works okay for us. But at the end of the day, the house ends up crashing. You know, that's the things with homes built on their foundations. You know, sometimes I'll drive around OB, and there's some beautiful homes here, especially if you're driving along Sunset Cliffs, and I like looking at a lot of the homes up there, but I've never once driven by these homes and said, man, what a nice looking foundation on that home. Have you ever said that? You ever just been like, that's just a great foundation. I just love how that foundation looked. We don't even see it or notice it, right? But again, like from the video we saw, it actually doesn't even matter how fancy or expansive the house is. If it's not on the right foundation, it's going to crash like any other house. And I was thinking about that. Yeah, guess that's true in our Christian life. Doesn't matter how fancy my Christian life is. I can be able to quote Bible verses to you, be doing good deeds, and know all the right stuff to say and do. But if it's not really built on God's wisdom, I mean, the first storm that comes is going to crash me and my faith. You probably know people who've walked away from God because of that very thing. Something hard happened in life. We blame God. We don't understand it because it's our own understanding and not His wisdom. And so we give up on God. Some of us, it's been us. And by the way, we're glad you're back. God's glad you haven't given up on Him. And so that's why it's worth challenging our wisdom against the wisdom of God. And human wisdom, as we know, it's just not always all that accurate anyway. I was reading about this movie producer in 1946. He said, television won't ever last because people are just going to get too tired of staring at a box every night. I thought, well, how wrong that was. Not only will we stare at a box in our living room, we'll carry around a box and stare at it and even watch TV on the tiniest screen. How do you even know what's happening on it? I don't know, but he said that. But there's a great military strategist, and right after airplanes were starting to become kind of commonplace, he said, airplanes are a great toy, but they'll never be of any military value at all. And that wasn't a very wise thing to say. One of the founders, one of the computers companies said, there's no reason people would ever end up wanting a computer in their house. So he was pretty wrong. Even Bill Gates, by the way, many would say wisest man who lived. I don't know if he's smart or wise or both, but he said, when it comes to memory, 640 kilobytes, that's the most any human could ever need at all. And If you know computers, we're much past K. We're on to megabytes, gigabytes, terabytes, and whatever's next. So, one more for you from a recording company. And right after they heard this band play, they said, that band's never going to make it. Not only that, guitar music is never going to last. And it was right after they heard the Beatles. So, they... not very good wisdom there. They missed out on a lot of money. Human wisdom, we saw last week, it has a timestamp. It expires. God's wisdom doesn't expire. That's why it's worth seeking God's wisdom and not our own. That's why when we ask God for it, remember one of the things our Father loves to do is give wisdom to his children. He loves giving that to us. And this has been our theme verse, James 1:5, and I challenge you to memorize it, and I'll still encourage you with that. That says, any time was written by the brother of Jesus. James says, whenever we lack wisdom, we ask God, and he gives it generously. Not a little bit of wisdom, he gives a lot. He gives it generously, like he did to Solomon, if we'll seek him and ask. And so then it's up to us to learn how to hear him speak in all the different ways that he speaks. So I wanted to remind you of something I did share it a couple months ago, but forgive me, I'm going to repeat it just because a lot of people came and told me it was a really helpful resource for them, and just in case you weren't here or forgot about it, but just a great book that's not too old, pretty recent, called Whisper, and actually one of our women's groups is studying this book right now. Just a great book about all the different ways God speaks into us. I'm like you. I'm always like, I just want to get better at knowing how to hear from God because it can feel so hard sometimes. And he talks this book about 7 different ways God speaks to us. And I had never heard these before. I knew Scripture and I knew prayer and through other people, but some of these were kind of new for me, so I thought it might be helpful for you. And we don't have time to go into it all, but you can read the book or find people that have written articles that recap the book. But he talks about the idea of God speaking into us in all different ways, through opened and closed doors in our lives, even through dreams. That's a great chapter. I was reading that one the other day. And he speaks even through our desires. What does your gut tell you? What if the Holy Spirit is your gut? He can even speak through our pain. When the storms hit, there can actually be wisdom of God midst of that pain. So just this idea that, when James says, ask God, he gives it generously. God says, yeah, I do. In fact, I'm speaking all these ways. Now, you've made wisdom a priority by being here. So good job. I know there's a lot of things you could be doing on a Sunday night in San Diego. And you're here, and this is one of the places that I hope God is speaking wisdom into you. But remember, it's not the only one. Right? So, and you could be listening to these ways kind of all week long. Right? And so he wants to speak into us in all these different ways. And one of the ways, and this is what I want to land on, all right? So here's our final piece of this. One of the ways that we can know if what we're hearing is wisdom from God, I never realized, but James himself actually puts this in his letter. So chapter 1, he says, ask God, he gives generously to everyone. Then in chapter 3, he says, and here's how you're going to know when it's wisdom from God. And I'd never noticed before, he actually gives us a test. You could run something in your head, maybe an idea you're considering, a prompting, and you're like, how do I know if this is wisdom from God? And he gives you 7 things. You could run it through this test and see, does it line up with these? And if it does, then you'd know it's most likely wisdom from God. And so these are the things. You can read it more and kind of think through it more on your own. We don't have time to totally go into it, but I want you to see that and know that, right? So like, for example, if I'm hearing kind of something and I'm like, man, how do I know if this decision is wisdom from God? Well, I can run it through this and say, well, is it pure? I mean, is it full of envy, jealousy, even lust? Or is it something that shows purity? Is it peace-loving? Does it actually fight for unity, work toward unity? One of the things Jesus said in that famous Sermon on the Mount I mentioned at the beginning, he said, blessed are the peacemakers. Right? Blessed are the peacemakers. Not just the peace lovers. We have a lot of peace lovers in OB, by the way. A lot of people that love peace and love. But it's not just peace lovers, not even just peacekeepers. He says, blessed are peacemakers. If what you're deciding to do is going to cause division, it may not be godly wisdom. Because God's always about reconciling, about unity, loving peace. God's wisdom is never critical and hurting people and tearing down. It's gentle. And his wisdom is never arrogant and stubborn. It's willing to yield and submit. It holds things open-handed. His wisdom is full of mercy, meaning it's always looking to the needs of others. His wisdom doesn't show favoritism. It's sincere, it's authentic. The opposite of hypocrisy, seeing one thing and doing another. God's wisdom says, I'm going to live by what my faith is. And so you could kind of run through this filter of these things and know, does this line up with godly wisdom? And I just wanted to, just right before we pray here, I want to pray through this verse, but just share with you real quick. Just awesome story. My good friend got to meet this guy a couple years ago, a guy named Bob Buford, and you can look him up, but made a ton of money in the cable TV industry. Got super wealthy there, super successful business guy, became a CEO. So made all this money in cable TV, and Bob had, kind of like Solomon, the huge house, kind of palace. Instead of camels, he drove a Jaguar. But so he had that, would travel all the time with his family. All this stuff really kind of made it, about as far as anybody can get. And at age 44, he said he started kind of having this kind of crisis. I don't know if it's midlife crisis, but there is actually a term for what he had now. It's called success panic. So many people hit this that they've named it now. Psychologists have named it. He hit the success panic of, what if this is all there is? It's not enough. Like, I built everything I kind of ever wanted, and there's still something missing. And I believe that's him hitting the wall of his human wisdom. Human wisdom built on sand, it works for a little while. But it only gets you so far. And then the storms of life come. And for him, the storm that hits while he's having this kind of crisis, while he's 44, his 24-year-old son Ross ended up drowning. He drowned trying to swim across the Rio Grande River. And Bob is just trying to figure out how to process. He already had this, and now this storm in life that hits him. And he said, it's the first time I couldn't buy my way out of something or plan my way out of something, right? Because his human wisdom hit a wall. And so, no joke, he ends up turning. I mean, he did get dragged by his parents to church as a kid, but just never stuck with it or built his life on that wisdom. And so he ends up turning to Proverbs 3, trust in God's wisdom with all your heart, not your own understanding. And so he decided to start trying to build his life on God's wisdom, a different foundation, because his life was crashing. And so he did. He wrote, by the way, a great book. It's called Halftime. Because for him, he said, that period of my life, that was like halftime of my life. And now God's going to do something different with the second half of my life. And so wrote Halftime, started this great organization called Leadership Network. It helps volunteers and pastors and stuff all over the country just kind of figure out how to just serve people and kind of do church better. We actually just sent some pastors to a Leadership Network thing last week. So that organization is going, wrote this book, did this whole thing. His saying that so many people ended up remembering him for, his friends, they said, man, Bob was always saying, I really want my fruit to get to grow on other people's trees. He just really wanted to make his life about making everybody else really successful. And when my buddy met Bob, he was speaking at a thing, and here's an older, successful business guy, so you expect him to be dressed, really nice. He's just wearing this T-shirt, and it just says 100X on it, 100X. So my buddy's like, well, what does that mean? What does that stand for? It's not like the size of the shirt. So what is that? What does 100X mean? And he said, when I started building my life on God's wisdom, I realized that everything that I have in my life, God actually gave me. He actually took the risk to invest all of that in me. And so I want God to get 100 times return on his investment in me. In my whole life, I want God to get 100 times return and know that he didn't waste his investment in me. And so Bob built his life on this godly wisdom. He did pass away just a year ago. But how cool that his legacy isn't his life just crashed, lost his son, became miserable, bankrupt. His life could have crashed. I mean, man, if your life's going to crash for something, that's a pretty hard reason, right? But it didn't. He said, I'm building my life on foundation of God's wisdom. And that's what your Father wants for you. Build it on his. It'll carry you through anything. And so I'd love to pray that over you. Actually, found I usually just like to pray kind of spirit leads, but I found a written prayer I really want to use for you about this verse. It was powerful for me, so I'd love to pray that over you as we close. So let's pray together. Father, we just come to you. We seek your wisdom that Jesus' own brother James writes about. So we make this our prayer. Lord, make me hungry for a pure heart. Lord, help me be a peacemaker and not a peace breaker.